Matthew chapter 13 is where we are today. Matthew 13, we're going to be looking at parable. Jesus is in the midst of telling some parables here in Matthew 13, and we're going to be looking at one of them. So we're going to be beginning at verse 24, reading verses 24 through 30, which is the parable proper. And then we're going to be jumping to verse 36, where Jesus explains this parable, and reading through verse 43. And the title of our message this morning is Longing for the Harvest. Longing for the harvest. Matthew 13, beginning at verse 24. He put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared also. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, 'Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?' He said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' So the servants said to him, 'Then do you want us to go and gather them?' But he said, 'No, lest in gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" And then jumping to verse 36. Then he left the crowds and went into the house. And his disciples came to him, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field." He answered, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed is the sons of the kingdom. The weeds are the sons of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. But then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears, let him hear." This is the word of the Lord. Well, brothers and sisters, it seemed appropriate, as I was considering what to preach on today, that we should focus on a passage about harvest, or about the harvest. Of course, it is harvest time. And if we look around, particularly if we drive out of town a little bit, we see the activities of harvest all around us taking place. This is, of course, also, as we've already noted, and is obvious at this point, the time of year that we stop to thank God for the bounty that He has brought forth from the earth yet again, and that is both from the fields and from gardens. You know, the harvest has really been going on since, mid-July or so. We get that first ripe tomato or whatever it happens to be out of the garden, and we enjoy the bounty of the harvest. It's often mentioned, at least it is around me, in looking at an infant or a newborn, just what a miracle life is, right? How could this be? It's a miracle. But I almost want to say it's no less a miracle to look at the way that God brings food forth from the ground. I mean, if you just looked at the dirt and somebody told you, okay, food comes from, I've sometimes told the story of being a young lad and my family was picking asparagus, walking the field and picking asparagus. We did that to pay for Christian school tuition. And these city slickers stopped by. They drove down to DeMont that day on a Saturday, and they were just wandering around, and so they stopped and talked to us. And I remember so clearly this gentleman from the city going, so this just grows up from the ground then? And I remember thinking, who are you? I mean, how dumb do you have to be? Of course it comes up from the ground. But he was touching on something that is genuinely miraculous, that food grows up from the earth. And so God has been about that work again in this year, and we have tasted of the harvest again, and will continue to as those crops are brought in, and so we give him thanks and praise for that. Now, I chose specifically to speak on this harvest passage because of a couple of things. First of all, because of the way that it meets us where we live as God's people who live and seek to be fruitful, and that imagery of fruitfulness and the grain and such being echoing in God's word in many different places, even the passages that we've looked at over the last several months, but also being surrounded by weeds and that kind of existence and how to address or approach that kind of life. But also in the way that this passage gives us not only understanding, but also great encouragement for both our present circumstances and especially for our future. And so hopefully it will have that effect in us this morning and help lead us then to Thanksgiving in a very helpful way. The harvest in Scripture is almost always described as a time of great joy. That the harvest time there would be various festivals and those kind of things where they would be celebrating together and giving thanks for the harvest, and that makes particular good sense in their context because a bountiful harvest really meant that they would survive. We have been insulated from that in the modern world for a number of reasons, things that have been developed over time. But for the vast majority of human experience, life depended on the harvest. If there wasn't a good harvest, then things were going to get a little difficult moving forward. And even though we've been insulated from that, it wasn't so long ago during COVID that we had a little bit of a taste of that. When suddenly the flow stopped and the shelves became rather bare at the store very quickly, it gave you that renewed understanding of, oh my goodness, this stuff all has to come from somewhere. And that flow has to continue in order for life to continue the way we have grown accustomed to. So, in the Scriptures, the harvest was almost always described as a time of great joy and celebration. There were many threats to a successful harvest. Those are recounted in Scripture too. The bugs could come and eat it up, or a storm could blow it down, or an enemy could come and gobble it up. A lot of things could happen to your harvest. And so, actually getting there was a great relief and great joy. It's safe now. We've gathered it out of the field. We've got it safely stored away. We can have some relief and trust that the coming winter or the coming winter season, we will have sufficient food to eat. A similar thing is going on in our passage this morning of the harvest that it speaks of. A harvest that also seems to have many threats to its success. Of God's gathering in his people safely, securely, that none should be lost, that none of the threats to their reaching the harvest should be succumbed to. As the weeds of the wicked seem always to be working to crowd out the godly, to undo the godly, And as we face that situation in our own day, more and more, these words of Jesus bring comfort and strength. So we look at them for that purpose. There are three main things that we want to touch on here as we look at this passage. And the first of those might seem obvious, but I think it's a helpful reminder to us. And that is that this is, of course, a parable. Jesus is telling a parable, which means that this passage, this lesson, this message is a message specifically, as he says, to those who have ears to hear. Now, earlier in this ongoing discourse, Jesus explains why he teaches in parables, and he instructs the disciples that they should be grateful and rejoicing that they have ears to hear, that they have eyes that can see, because the world, those that have not been given those eyes and ears by God, as he draws them to be his children, they can't see, they can't hear, they don't understand these things. And that parables are sort of a test, a dividing line, where those who have ears to hear are going to understand what's being said, and those who don't have ears to hear are not going to understand what's being said. It's sort of like being spoken in some kind of code as he tells a parable. So while others may be listening, and undoubtedly others were listening, the message is for us, this parable. Now, thinking back on last week's message and thinking about the work of the Spirit that Jesus talks about, that as the Spirit comes after he ascends to heaven, the Spirit will help the disciples because he will convict the world with regard to sin and righteousness and judgment. As we come off a passage like that and a reflection of those things, it might seem to us quite useful for unbelievers to hear this parable and to hear about the ways in which Jesus describes the weeds being thrown into the fiery furnace. That is, that seems like a pretty effective way to convict of both sin and of judgment, right? That judgment is coming. But it does not seem as though that part is included for that purpose, since this is a message to us. And one of the ways I think that we can see that is that the rest of the gospel is not there. In other words, that message of the weeds being thrown into the fiery furnace is not sort of point number one to be given in the story. And that point number two is, therefore God has supplied the payment for our sin, a Redeemer. His name is Jesus Christ, and that through repentance and faith, we can then avoid the judgment of God that's coming. That would be the fullness of the gospel. It's only this one aspect of things, sort of point 1 and 3. There is sin. There are those who are in line for the judgment of God, and at the end of time, that is what they will receive. It doesn't have the fullness of the gospel, so even though that might sound helpful, that's not why it's in here. The message is not being given then to change hearts, this specific message in this parable, but rather to strengthen hearts, to strengthen our hearts. One other note regarding parables that it will be good for us to touch on before we proceed is reminding ourselves of the limits of parables. Parables have limits. Parables have a lot of limits because parables are told for one specific purpose, not several purposes all at the same time. In other words, those similar items may be referred to in other parables. They are not to be blended together with other parables. As an example, we have right in the same chapter Jesus' parable of the sower and the soils. And we have then two parables that have a lot of similar items within them, a lot of similar pictures being painted. For example, in the parable of the sower, it also describes a certain plot of ground that has both good plants and weeds growing together. but they do not refer to the same things as here. And you can see how confusing that would be if that were the case. Because in that parable, the message to the people whose lives are being described as containing both plants for being fruitful and weeds that are choking out the plants, the message is get rid of the weeds, which is a completely different instruction than what he's giving here. No, don't get rid of the weeds. So you see how confusing it gets if we blur two parables together. Even though they have very similar contents, one of the main rules of our understanding parables is to keep them separate. In order not to misinterpret it, each parable needs to be viewed on its own. I'm suddenly having, there we go. So that we don't misinterpret it, it needs to be viewed on its own. We'll see that more here in a bit. Another limit of parables are also limited by the very nature of an analogy. Okay? If you use an analogy, you use an analogy for a specific thing, and the analogy can't be taken too far. So I'll give you an example of that. If somebody came up to you and said, boy, you know, you are a rock. Okay, I'm a rock. Well, what do they mean by that? Well, they mean something specific. So are you saying that I'm strong and I can be relied upon, those kind of things? Or are you saying that I'm largely sedentary and I really don't get around very much? What are you trying to say about me by saying that I'm a rock? See, there's an intention with that picture, with that metaphor, but it only goes so far. Okay? Don't try to push it beyond the way I intend it, because if you push it beyond the way I intend it, you're going to misinterpret what I'm saying. Parables have that about them as well, just because of the limits of analogies. Jesus uses a parable to say something very specific about the kingdom of God, and we have to be careful not to push that analogy too far, because then we can come up with crazy ideas of what he's actually saying, and that we'll see here in just a minute. So, parables are limited to which specific aspect of the kingdom they are explaining. Okay? Now, let's get more to the parable itself. The second thing we see here in our parable is God's confirmation that there are, in fact, two kinds of people in the world. Two. There are not 3 or 4 or 5, nor is there one kind of people in the world. There are exactly two kinds of people. There are the sons of the kingdom, and there are the sons of the evil one. And this is by far not the only place that Jesus makes this point. There are two kinds of people. You could think in terms of this idea of being sons. There are two families. There is the family of God, and there is the family of the evil one, as Jesus says here, and in his engagements with the crowds a number of different times. Two kinds of people. Now, the limits of the parable do not allow it to accurately picture the history of our creation, fall, and redemption. Okay? In other words, so though we understand that these things are a given, so when we look at the history, how we came to be children of God, and we think back on the biblical testimony of how we came to be children of God, it doesn't seem as though it lines up perfectly with the description in here in the parable of being sown as children of God, like we were children of God from the beginning. It doesn't seem to line up with what we know to be the redemptive historical reality of Jesus creating mankind good, the fall into sin, that all of us are under God's judgment, and that we're brought to him and we are redeemed by Christ to be his children. All of that, none of that seems to be present here in the parable. That is, the analogy of the parable is not about that. And so to try to understand those things based on what the parable says is not proper. It's not what the focus of the parable is. Let's just say a little bit more about that here a second. Jesus is not here teaching that some people from birth were godly and that others were evil. That there was from the beginning a difference between this group of people and that group of people. That's not what he's intending to teach with this parable. He is simply saying that those who are sons of the kingdom are the result of his work, and those who are the sons of the evil one are a result of the devil's work. Okay? So this allusion to the sowing, I mean, what would you have to do? How would you have to adjust this parable, this analogy, to make it exactly fit the historical record of creation, fall, and redemption? What would that story sound like? So I sowed seed, and then it became corrupted seed, and then I figured out a way to uncorrupt some of the seed, and I left others of the seed fully corrupt. I mean, you'd have like 8 pages of preamble in the story in order to try to make all that. That doesn't matter. Nothing that Jesus is saying here in his description is inaccurate. As I said, all he's saying is, look, those who are sons of the kingdom are because of my work, and those that are sons of the evil one are because of the devil's work. Let's just leave it there. That's not the focus of the parable. And this idea, though, going back to this idea that there are two kinds of people in this world, the sons of the kingdom and the sons of the evil one, keeps us from the silly, sentimental statement that we hear all too often, well, we're all God's children. No. We're not all God's children. Now, what people mean by that might be true, but specifically, as the Bible describes it, we're not all God's children. We are all made in his image. We are all image bearers of God, and because of that, we all have equal value. And every human being should be treated as a full image bearer of God. We're all image bearers of God, made in his image and of equal value. But we are not all God's children. And this is something that we have to be very clear about as we live in this world, as we live as wheat among weeds, for 2 main reasons. One is it brings urgency to our evangelism. Whenever we start falling into this way of thinking of, well, you know, we're all really God's children, aren't we? That kind of thinking almost immediately reduces the urgency of evangelism, because it begins to reduce the difference between being a child of God and a child of the evil one. It reduces our sense of urgency for evangelism to think in those terms. But the other thing that it also does, and clarity on this helps us with, is having strength for our distinctiveness. See, the scriptures in that passage in 2 Corinthians 6 is just one of them that says, look, you were made to be different. So come out from among them and be different. Don't live like the world. Don't be like the world. Don't live according to its values and its principles. You need to live according to God's values and his principles, and in that sense, come out from among them and be separate, not like go off and have your own colony somewhere, but identify, be distinct, be that light on a hill. Be the salt of the earth. Be that distinctive people that show yourself to be children of God. And the more that you talk about and kind of think about, well, you know, we're all really just children of God, aren't we? Well, what you're working to do, whether you know it or not, what you're working to do is remove the distinctiveness. Now, if what you're saying is, look, we don't look down our nose at other people, great, then say that. If what you want to say is, we recognize that we are only children of God by God's grace, and if it wasn't for His grace, we would be in our sins still too, great, say that. But don't say we're all God's children, because we're not all God's children. And to be clear about that, as Jesus is so abundantly clear about that again and again and again, that there are two types of people, gives urgency to our evangelism, and it gives strength to our distinctiveness. We are not called to be just like other people. Even though we're human and we have flaws and frailties and all that kind of thing, we're called to be God's people. And I think the more that we look at this, the more that we're going to be urged to embrace that idea of God's people. So, the parable is a parable. This passage is a parable, and for that reason we know that it's a message to us. We also know the limits of parables. We know what it's trying to say, and at least at this point we know what it's not trying to say. We see here again that Jesus makes it very clear to us that as we live in this world as His children, there are not only people like us, there are people who are much different than us. And He Himself describes them as those of us being His children as being the wheat, as being the fruitful plants, and the other children as being the weeds. His description. So, the third thing then, as we think about, so what then do we do in a situation where the wheat is living in the midst of weeds? The third thing that we see here is that the answer to this situation is not a preemptive, forceful removal of the weeds, but rather a confident expectation of the harvest. Now, let's deal with that first one first. The answer is not a preemptive, forceful removal of the weeds. And it's not that, not because that won't in time happen, or because that's not God's intention or His desire. It is. That's clearly here in the parable as well. So it's not as though this idea of a forceful purging of the earth of the wicked, it's not as though that is an idea God is against. It's part of His plan. But He is against our implementing it in this age as we wait for the harvest. And the reason that He wants us to wait, tells us to wait, not to take matters into our own hands in this forceful, kind of violent way, is because in so doing, some of His children would also be uprooted. Now, if you think about that in the context of a parable, that it's being symbolic, what would that mean, to be lost? It couldn't simply mean, so let's envision, that like the church goes out with a sword and just tries to eliminate everybody on earth who's not a believer. That kind of crazy thinking, but that's what's being thought of here. Should we just get them out? We might be tempted to think that with having some of His children also uprooted would mean that perhaps they'd be like collateral damage, and maybe they'd be killed in the battle or something like that. But I don't think that's what He can be meaning, because they still wouldn't be lost. I mean, they might be uprooted in that physical sense, but they'd still be His children. They'd still be within His care. They'd go to be with Him. So then what could it mean for his being concerned that some of His children might be uprooted? And I think what He means by that is lost to Him. What could that refer to? What would that look like in practical actions? What does it look like for one of His children to be uprooted? Hold on to that question for just a second. Before that, we need to make the point then that unlike the servants of Muhammad, the servants of Christ do not seek the fruition or the fulfillment of their religion at the edge of a sword. Islam does teach that. Christ does not teach that. Now, one other real quick qualifier before we go answer that previous question on what it looks like for his children to be uprooted. While we do, as his children, strongly support, and we've been going over this in adult education lately, while we do strongly support civil government's use of the sword as it has been instructed by God, in other words, Jesus' point here is not there should be no use of swords until the end. No, because he's already entrusted the civil government with a sword to punish the wrongdoer and protect the innocent. So we, as his people, we're strongly in support of that use of the sword. We're simply saying that the sword is not intended to bring about the kingdom of heaven. That's the distinction. So we support one use, not the other use. Now, let's get back to the question, what would it look like for God's children to potentially be uprooted while his servants were trying to cull or purge the world of the weeds? I think there are two main ways in which we could understand the danger that is being referred to. And one of them is the problem of identification. Because some of the wheat could be confused with the weeds. How do you know what is wheat and what is weeds? There is a great problem of identification here. Especially because, and particularly in the context that Jesus is talking about, the wheat and the tares, as they're referred to, look very similar. So here's a picture of two of them. On the left, we have the wheat while it's growing. This is before it's fully mature, okay? And on the right, you have the tares. And so as you can see, if you were walking through a field that had wheat and tares in it, it'd be a painstaking process to make sure that you only took out tares and you didn't pull any wheat out. So there's an identification issue that would be a real hurdle to get over. But what's interesting is that the wheat looks a lot like the tares during the growing season, but the closer you get to harvest time, the more it begins to look different. I think that's a very interesting thing, and something that we've talked about quite a bit, that it seems very clear that within the Scriptures, as it describes mankind moving toward the end of this age, that the very unfolding of those events and the testing that people are put under begins to reveal, as we get closer and closer to the harvest, the reality of people's faith begins to be more and more clearly revealed. So those that you might have thought looked really like weeds, all of a sudden, by the work of God and the events that are going on, they suddenly become clearly wheat. And others that you might have thought always, oh, they're definitely wheat. As you get closer and closer to the end and they're put to the test, suddenly, boy, they really are weeds. And so there seems to be an identification, certainly there's an identification hurdle and difficulty that would present itself, such that we as his servants, there'd be no way that we could tell for sure who were the wheat and who were the weeds. And that clarity is borne out the closer we get to the harvest. So that's one problem. Another problem, though, I think, or another issue as to why some of the children would get weeded out and lost, is because of the process of evangelization. God is currently in the process of executing a precise, perfectly tuned plan to bring to himself all those who are chosen. It's ongoing. And in line with what we were just saying about the process of time and people being tested and all that kind of thing. There are many people who right now give every evidence of being weeds, because that's what they are right now, whom God has placed his sights on and has determined he is bringing them to himself and that he will make them his children. And that process is unfolding. And that process is going to unfold right up until the harvest. And so if you short-circuit that somehow and try to force the harvest to come early, you're going to short-circuit this work that God is doing, and a number of his children would, in fact, be uprooted. They would be lost. Acting in that way then would short-circuit the plan that God is working out and leave intended sons of the kingdom out of the kingdom. So for those reasons, it seems clear that the master's instruction has to be, no. Don't try to pull the weeds out. It's not your role to pull the weeds out. Instead, Jesus points them to a confident expectation of the harvest. A confident expectation of the harvest. And in so doing, it's very interesting, and I think very important for us to note, in so doing, Jesus is telling us implicitly that while taking matters into our own hands will threaten some portion of his children, patiently waiting for the harvest will not. In other words, for the fullness of the harvest to come in, we need to be patient, and we need to live in the place that God has put us, even though it may be filled with weeds, to live faithfully in the place that God has put us, because living patiently and waiting for his timing of the harvest is precisely the way that we can guarantee that none will be lost. And so we need not fear the sons of the evil one for ourselves, or worry that they will somehow be successful in reducing the sons of the kingdom or the number of the sons of the kingdom that God is bringing to himself. They will not. And while the path to the harvest for us and for all of God's children may be filled, not only may be, but will be filled with difficulty for us, one thing we know is that the harvest is coming. One of the things that's also noteworthy, I believe, is the way in which God has so created his world to reinforce the process that he is going to use for the redemption of man and the consummation of all things. And see, we always think about it the other way around. We think that God somehow first created the world with these seasons and these growing seasons. And then, we have this harvest thing that we have every year. And then one day God said, you know what? I could use that. That harvest thing, that's really similar to what I plan to do with all. That didn't work that way. It was the other way around. Why did God create his world to have harvests? Because that is exactly what he plans to do at the consummation of all things. And that on an annual basis, we will be reminded of the harvest and the difference between wheat and weeds, and the reality that at some point along the way, harvest time comes that we might be ready for the harvest. And so, as we're living, waiting for and longing for the harvest, knowing that all his children are secure in his hands until the moment of the harvest, and then it's at the moment of the harvest that all of us will be secure in the kingdom that is to come, we know that the threats and lies and hate of the weeds will, in fact, at one point be no more. that though they are very loud and they are very threatening, and that they can do various types of damage to us as God's people along the way, we are confident that those days are numbered. And that at that time, the righteous will live and will shine like the sun. So, coming in full circle, for those who do have ears to hear and eyes to see, the harvest is a reminder not only of the goodness of God in his common grace to all, but also of the goodness of God's special grace that makes us his children and points us to the coming harvest of all men, where evil will in fact be forcibly removed by the reapers, the angels, and our joy forevermore will be unhindered. What could that message do to those who understand, who have the ears and eyes to hear and see, but to give them added strength to hold to Christ and a greater longing for the coming harvest? Now, all of us, I'm sure, will be taking part in some kind of Thanksgiving gatherings. We will be celebrating the goodness of God and the harvest. Take the opportunity, as you have the ability, not only to thank God for his goodness to all people as he sends rain and sun on the evil and the good and provides all these good things for them. Make sure, if they're looking for, in a lot of those groups, they're usually looking for a volunteer to pray, right? You're all standing around and you kind of look around the room. Sometimes you got if you have a pastor in the family, everybody looks at you, you got to pray. But if they're looking for a volunteer, be the volunteer. Thank God for his amazing goodness, common grace to all, even to those who ignore him. Make that point. And then thank him that there is a coming harvest, and that everything that causes sin and evil and wickedness and all those who are aligned with it will be removed, and that his children then will shine like the sun. Think of that harvest as we celebrate this one.